In today's build video, I'm going to show you how to make these custom cherry bar stools. A good portion of this project was already completed before I stepped into the shop. Both legs, riser block, and the two aprons were designed in SketchUp and cut on a CNC machine to use as templates. While I picked through the lumber rack for both bar stools, I wanted to take a minute to thank Acme Tools for sponsoring this build video. Acme Tools offers the highest quality products at competitive prices since 1948. They offer a wide selection of tools and equipment for woodworkers, do-it-yourselfers, and contractors from all major manufacturers. For more information, check them out at acmetools.com or click the link in the description below. Let's get back to the build. Luckily, I was able to find clear and wide 8/4 cherry stock at my sawmill, so I had very minimal waste and could get the majority of the parts out of just one board. When laying out the legs, I made sure to put the templates over the straight grain sections of the board so that the grain of the legs wouldn't distract from the nicer figure of the backrest and the seat. With all of the parts laid out on the cherry board, I had to use my jigsaw to break it down because the board was a monster. It was over 15 inches wide and 10 feet long. With the parts broken down to rough length, I used the bandsaw to cut to rough width. I chose the bandsaw to save stock since the curve from the bandsaw is much smaller than my full curve table saw blade. Next, I head over to the joiner planer combo and flatten one face and one edge to then run it through the planer down to its final thickness. With all the parts taken down to their final thickness, I can begin the template routing. I first lay the template on the board and trace it using a marker. When rough cutting the size of the bandsaw, I stay no less than 1/8 of an inch away from the line. I also wanted to mention that I'm using a wider resaw blade, so that means that I had to make relief cuts when cutting into the sharp corners. Now we become best friends with the double-sided tape, and boy do I mean it. I put several pieces of tape on the cherry board and then place a 1/4 inch MDF template on the tape and give it a good press to make sure it won't move. Since I've got a lot of pieces to cut at the router table, I'm using an upcut spiral flush trim bit, not only because it's going to last a long time, but also because I don't want to flip the board over to route with the grain in places where the grain switches directions. I route both sides and the top, leaving the leg just a little bit longer than the template. I can now cut the rear legs to length at the miter saw by first setting the angle of the blade to the angle of the bottom of the foot. Next, with the blade flush with the end of the template, I clamp a stop block in place so that it's flush with the top of the rear leg template. This will make sure that all rear legs of the bar stool are the same exact length. Now I can place the cherry leg up against the stop block and cut them to length. If you're ever cutting more than one of anything, try to use a stop block for repeatability. It's pretty awesome. With the rear legs done, I can repeat the same steps with the front legs. I first cut them the rough size of the bandsaw, staying 1/8 of an inch away from the line, and then using the flush trim bit, remove the rest of the waste. Since the front legs were straight, I just used the crosscut sled with a stop block to cut all 4 of them to length. Next, I focus on cutting the 4 riser blocks to size. Just like the front and rear legs, I begin by cutting the freshly milled boards to length and width at the table saw. Both ends of the riser blocks are cut at an angle, so before cutting the curve on the bottom, I first cut the angles using the crosscut sled once again. Cutting the angles before the curve makes it easier, since I can just rest it up against the fence of the crosscut sled. With the angles cut, I put some double-sided tape on the cherry board and then place the template on top of the tape. Next, I head over to the bandsaw to remove the majority of the waste. And just like the legs, I next head over to the router table and make an exact copy of the riser blocks using the flush trim bit. With the legs and the riser blocks cut to size, I can start working on the joinery. For the bar stools, I'm using the Festool domino, which cut the mortises for the loose tenons. For the thicker parts, which are the legs and the riser blocks, I placed 2 dominoes on each piece, and for the 3/4 inch parts, which are the 6 aprons, I put 1 domino on each end. One of the most important steps in using the domino is to accurately transfer your marks from one piece to the other. That just leaves the aprons. Each bar stool has 6 aprons, with 2 of them being a little different. Just like the legs, I tried to pick the straighter grain for the aprons when milling up the lumber. Luckily, I didn't run into any issues because the rough stock was pretty wide, in which I had some straight grain on the edges to choose from. Since I'm using 8/4 lumber and the aprons were only 3/4 of an inch thick, I was able to get all 12 aprons for both bar stools out of 6 pieces. It just required a little bit of resawing at the bandsaw, but first I had to flatten one face and get a 90-degree edge before running them through the bandsaw. After resawing the boards, I can take them down to their final thickness at the planer, followed by cutting the pieces to width at the table saw. I used the templates to line up the stop block, and then I cut them to length. The other 4 aprons simply had a 90-degree end on the end, so I just reset the miter gauge to 90 and cut them to length as well. Next, I mark center lines on the pieces and route the mortises using the domino. Now I can tape the template on the board and then take it over to the router table to flush cut them to shape. With the joinery cut on the ends of the aprons, I need to mark their locations on the legs. I rotated the leg to cut the joinery with the domino. Since the top apron on the rear of the bar stool needs to be in the same location as the front apron, I measured from the bottom of the front leg since this will put the aprons in the same exact location. To use the domino on the rear leg for the top apron, I had to place a shim under the domino because the curve of the leg didn't allow for the domino to set flat. I ended up using a shim that was a little over 1/8 of an inch, as you can see here. Now since I shimmed the domino, that required me to also change the fence setting to compensate for the thickness of the shim. With the mortises cut on one rear leg, I use it to mark the locations on the second rear leg. It's super important that the aprons are in the same exact location on both legs so that the bar stools remain square, which ultimately means that the bar stool sits nice and flat on the floor. With the bases complete, I can now move on to making the bent lamination seat and backrest. This process required that I build a bending form, which I'm not going to cover in this build video, but if you wanted to see a video on me making the bending form, leave a comment below, and if enough people want to see it, I'll edit the video. Since the seat is 13 inches wide, I had to edge glue boards to have large enough panels to make the seat. So first I began by resawing 12-inch wide boards on the bandsaw. The seat was made up of three 3/16 of an inch panels to make the seat that's roughly 5/8 of an inch thick. Just like plywood, each layer of the seat had to have its grain rotated 90 degrees for stability. With the panels down to their 3/16 thickness, I can now cut them to their final width at the table saw. Since the grain rotated 90 degrees every other panel, I had to change the fence setting since the width of the panel would change. The top and bottom panel will have the grain going front to back, whereas the middle panel has the grain going left and right if you're facing the bar stool. To glue up panels that are a 1/4 inch or less, I like to simply use tape to act as a clamp. In order to use this method, you need to make sure that your boards are jointed and that there's no gap between the boards when you put them together. Next, I'll flip the panel over, open it up like a book, and place glue on the edges. You'll be able to tell immediately if you have enough glue because you should start to see some squeeze out. I take a wet paper towel and wipe up the excess glue. And finally, I place 3 more pieces of tape across the joint and then 1 long piece on top of the joint from top to bottom, and then I set the panel to the side to dry. All 3 panels are now dried and I'm ready to start the glue up in the bending form. I'm using plastic resin glue for this because it dries very hard, which will help keep the panels in the shape that you want. Before applying the glue, I looked at all 3 panels to decide which face I wanted to be the show face, and that panel will be face down on the bending form since the seat is concave. You're probably wondering why I'm using a brush instead of a roller, and that's a fantastic question. Unfortunately, I lost my roller and I kept telling myself that I would find it, but I never did. And I also poured too much glue on the panels and had quite a bit of squeeze out, so this part of the project wasn't exactly as I had it planned. With the glue on the panels, I used blue tape to help prevent the panels from moving too much. I used too much glue and they were sliding quite a bit. I had my bag already set up and the bending form in the bag, so all I had to do was place the seat on the bending form and make sure that it was lined up and not hanging over any of the edges of the form. Now in this video, I placed the mesh directly over the seat, and that was a mistake. I had so much glue squeeze out that glue was all over the mesh, which glued the mesh to the seat. Removing the mesh from the dry glue was not fun. I've since learned that using a piece of 3/16 hardboard that's the same size of the seat as a platen. Just make sure you put tape on the hardboard or at least wax it before placing it in the bag. Next, I start resawing yet again, but this time for the backrest. Like with the seat, it required 3 panels, which meant more edge gluing to make the panels before sticking them in the veneer bag. It's the same exact process, so I'll save you a couple of minutes and skip right to the air being sucked out of the bag. Oh, and notice no more mesh on the bending form. You'll still see the mesh in the bag under the port that helped the pump pull out all the air of the bag, so don't go and throw away your mesh, it's still needed. Before I joint the edges of the seat and the backrest, I first use a chisel to remove all of the big chunks of glue squeeze out. Oh, and remember how I mentioned the mesh stuck to the seat? Yeah, I need to remove that before edge joining the panel. I just used my orbital sander with some 80 grit paper to remove it. I jointed one edge of each of the backrest and seat, and then placed the convex back up against the joiner fence when running the board over the blade. If this edge isn't exactly 90 degrees to the back, it's not a huge deal. I'm mainly focused on cleaning it up so that I can run this edge up against the fence at the table saw to clean up the other edge. I cut the seat to length using my crosscut sled. I clean up one of the edges and then place that clean edge up against the stop block to then cut it to length. I use the same process on the backrest as well. And speaking of the backrests, I called an audible and decided to add a curve to the top and the bottom just to match the rest of the design. The top of the backrest has a convex curve and the bottom has a concave curve, which matches the seat's curve exactly. Next, I taped the template on the backrest and removed the majority of the waste at the bandsaw, and then followed that up at the router table with the flush trim bit. Unfortunately, I didn't make the template wide enough to span the full width of the backrest, so I had to remove the template and then move it to the bottom of the backrest to remove the rest of the waste. Before gluing up the bases, I rounded over each piece at the router table with an 1/8 inch roundover bit. The areas where the riser block meets the legs, I stopped short as the riser blocks are flush with the side of the legs, and if I were to round that over, it would look terrible. For the rest of the corners of the legs, I ran the bit from edge to edge. One final step before gluing up the base was to drill for the screws that would connect the seats to the riser blocks. I made a centerline mark on the bottom of the riser block and then made 2 more marks equally spaced from the edges for the screws. I first used a 3/8 inch Forstner bit to drill for the countersink hole, and then I followed it up by switching over to a 5/32 bit to drill a pilot hole for the screws. I put chalk on the corner of the riser blocks that needed to have the waste removed for the seat to sit flat on. I ended up putting about a 5-degree bevel on the riser blocks using my hand tools. This was a lot of removing waste, testing the fit, removing the waste, and testing the fit until the riser blocks matched the curve of the seat. The glue up was pretty straightforward. I placed glue in all of the mortises, and then I popped the dominoes in place, and everything came together. Each section only needed 2 clamps to hold them together. I did this glue up in 2 sessions. First, I glued one rear leg, riser block and apron, and front leg as one assembly, and then I came back the next day to glue up those 2 sections with the rest of the aprons. This just made it easier, and I also wanted to mention that I used hide glue because it lubricated the dominoes, whereas regular wood glue would have caused them to swell just a little bit. Now I can round over the parts of the bar stool that I didn't get to before the glue up, so I put an 1/8 inch roundover bit in my trim router and carefully rounded over the corners. I also took this opportunity to round over the edges of the backrest and the seat. To attach the seat, I first began by placing it in the correct location, measuring both sides of the seat, and it was roughly about 1 inch out from the rear legs. I put the screws in the hole and put a little bit of upward force so that the screws would leave an indentation on the seat so I knew where to pre-drill. I removed the seat, flipped it over, and pre-drilled with an 1/8 inch bit, making sure to put a piece of tape on the bit to indicate how deep I needed to drill. Now's not the time to drill all the way through the seat, and just don't ask me how I know. I'll just leave it at that. With the holes pre-drilled, I reinstalled the seat. Now I get to do this process one more time with the backrest. I placed the backrest over the rear leg, and then I traced the curve on the rear legs to give me an idea of how much waste I needed to remove. It's pretty much the same 5-degree bevel that's on the riser blocks, and to remove the waste, I used a block plane and my spoke shave. It was a slow process of removing the waste and testing the fit just like the seat, but after about 30 minutes I was able to get the backrest to fit just perfect. To attach the backrest, I initially started by gluing it to the rear legs since it was a long grain to long grain glue joint, and I made a mark on the back side of the backrest to help with lining it up during the clamping process. After the glue dried, I wanted to reinforce the glue by installing 2 screws on each side, so I began by using a 3/8 inch Forstner bit to drill a countersink hole about 1/4 of an inch deep. I followed that up by using an 1/8 inch bit to drill the countersink into the backrest, and then finally, I installed the screws. To fill the holes, I made my own plugs out of some scrap cherry. I put a 3/8 inch plug cutter into the drill press and then made a few plugs into the face grain of the scrap piece of cherry. Next, I went over to the bandsaw to cut the plugs free. I put a little bit of glue in the holes and then tapped the plugs into place. I made sure to orient the grain of the plugs so that they matched the grain orientation of the legs. After the glue dried, I used my flush trim saw to remove a majority of the waste, and then I followed it up with 220 grit on my orbital sander. And now it's time for some finish. For the Barstools, I didn't want a thick film finish because it doesn't need it. I will be sitting on them and not placing any drinks on them, so I wanted a close to the wood type of finish and nothing too glossy. So I wiped on 3 coats of the semi-gloss wiping varnish, and I sanded in between each coat using some 400 grit sandpaper. And the Barstools are done. I love the design of the Barstools, and I think they came out great. This was a very challenging but very gratifying build, and the cherry looks amazing, and I can't wait to see how they look in 20 years. I hope you enjoyed the build, and thanks for letting me share it with you and for watching. If you enjoyed the video, please hit the thumbs up button below and then let me know what you think of the Barstools in a comment below. And if you're not already subscribed, hit that subscribe button and hit the bell to get notified when I release new build videos. Once again, I wanted to thank Acme Tools for sponsoring this build video, and thanks for watching. I'll see you in the next build video.